Thank you for taking the time to watch my presentation on software engineering, the timely construction of the HealthCare.gov website. The website was designed to help facilitate the sale of private health insurance plans to residents of the United States and was designed to serve the 36 U.S. states that decided not to create their own state exchanges. There was much attention across the country on the launching of the website. According to Wikipedia, the rollout of HealthCare.gov went through as planned, but the launch was marred by serious technological problems, making it difficult to sign up for the website for health insurance. The original budget for the website for the prominent contractor CGI Federal was $93.7 million, but the OIG report found that the total cost eventually reached $1.7 billion. The goal of my presentation was to investigate the use of software engineering principles and if I could figure out how well the site had been engineered. To accomplish this goal, I used primarily the Office of Inspector General's report called HealthCare.gov, Case Study of CMS Management of the Federal Marketplace. I focused on select interviews, some of OIG's analysis, and focused on one of the key technological decisions made by CGI Federal. To provide a software engineering evaluation framework, I used class notes, selected principles of sound software engineering design by Pressman, some observations by Fowler and Brooks, and finally some software design myths that seemed pertinent to the OIG report. Who are the main participants in this presentation? Much of my material came from a report from the Office of Inspector General for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. The Office of Inspector General, or OIG, is responsible for identifying and combating waste, fraud, and abuse for over 300 of the Health and Human Services programs. CMS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, or CMS, was the group the Department of Health and Human Services chose to manage the rollout of this website. And finally, I've already mentioned CGI Federal, a Canadian company who had the prominent role in the design of the website. With this background information, let's look at some of the design principles that we think should be considered. Let's pause and think, what design principles would be most applicable to the HealthCare.gov website? I'll pause now for 10 seconds. I found these four of Pressman's core principles came to mind repeatedly as I went through the OIG report. Pressman says that clear vision is essential to the success of any software project. I plan to show that clear vision of how to accomplish the individual goals was a challenge for HealthCare.gov. The second bullet refers to keeping it simple. I think that this seemingly simple advice gets more difficult as one adds more levels of bureaucracy to a software project. Next, not coding yourself into a corner is interesting because often a good idea in the short term faces challenges over the life of the software development cycle, especially later in the maintenance phase. Finally, the phrase, placing clear, complete thought before any action almost always produces better results, may have been the most applicable principle to the entire OIG report. Let's look at this one a little further. Fred Brooks, in the Mythical Man Month, makes this statement: "The hardest single part of building a software system is deciding what to build. No part of the work so cripples the resulting system if done wrong. No other part is more difficult to rectify later." I think both Pressman and Brooks are trying to make the same point here, which is that putting time into knowing exactly what you want to build and how to build it before you get started is much more effective than heading off in the wrong direction and trying to catch up by moving faster to get to the right place as your deadline approaches. Let's see what the OIG thought. This is directly from the OIG report. If we skip to the underlined text, solidifying business requirements and technical specifications was slow and involved much iteration, One thing I want to point out is that iteration is used here instead of the word repetition. Can you think of why repetition might be a better word choice? I will come back to this in a later slide. Let's see how the CMS contractors felt about the requirements they were giving. They said, when we started the build, the requirements they knew were in the middle. Things at the beginning, such as the application, were still being decided and were not solved until very late in the process. Clearly, this CMS contractor was not pleased with the requirements gathering. I wonder if they still work for CMS. I have not mentioned Agile programming, and so let's look at how that was used in this project. Agile was used by CGI Federal. The OIG said, the selected method of software development made it easier for policy makers to seek frequent and late changes. It seems to me that the OIG is trying to indicate that Agile was actually partially to blame for the glitches experienced by HealthCare.gov. Do you agree with this? Let's see what the CGI Federal managers thought. They said CMS did not define business requirements at the beginning of each sprint and often made changes throughout the sprint, which inhibited the Agile method and resulted in incomplete development. In the last slide, I mentioned that repetitive was a better choice for describing the process of going back and redefining the software components. I wonder if the software engineers for CGI Federal would agree with their managers or the OIG. I believe Fowler would not entirely agree on how the OIG characterizes Agile development as being partially to blame for the problems with the development of the HealthCare.gov website. Fowler says, the iterative style breaks down a project by subsets of functionality. You take a quarter of the requirements and do the complete software lifecycle for that quarter: analysis, design, code, and test. At the end of the first iteration, you'd have a system that does a quarter of the needed functionality. Fowler uses the term iterative to show progression. If you are breaking a project down iteratively, you make progress on each iteration. What does iteration mean when the OIG said solidifying business requirements and technical specifications was slow and involved much iteration? There is actually a lack of progress implied by iteration in that statement. This is why on the earlier slide I suggested repetition might be a better word choice. CMS seemed to be repetitively going through a requirement cycle but not making progress. The OIG report mentioned poor technological decisions that contributed to the glitches. So I wanted to look at one of these decisions that CGI Federal put in their proposal to use both Oracle, a popular traditional relational database platform, with NoSQL, which uses non-tabular documents to store data. In the first block, you see that CMS seemed to like this idea. They said, given that each type has different benefits, CMS indicated in its evaluation of CGI Federal's contract proposal that the use of both Oracle and NoSQL databases was a strength. The problem was that CGI Federal did not like the MarkLogic implementation of NoSQL because they did not think they could find the staff to successfully field the project, and it introduced too much risk. CMS overrode this decision by issuing a Technical Direction Letter, TDL. The OIG reported that CGI Federal never retained the number of experts needed to configure and integrate the MarkLogic technology. With this background on one key technological choice, let's return to our evaluation framework. This is another pause and think. So let's think about how you would rate the decision to use two database systems based on the core principles mentioned earlier. Here's 10 seconds. I picked all of the above. Honestly, it's always a little unfair to go back and judge something based on how you know it turned out. Hence the saying, hindsight is always 20/20. Here's my rationale so you can decide if you agree with me or not. With regards to clear vision is essential to the success of any software project, I believe with the knowledge that this project had to be done on time with minimal functionality, and by this I mean a minimum of functionality, I can't think of any reason to add a newer and possibly riskier technology like NoSQL to the timeline. Looking at keeping it simple, I think one database system is simpler to implement and maintain. This leads nicely to be open to future changes. Don't code yourself into a corner. There is no reason I found in the OIG report that NoSQL could not have been added later with less pressure. Forcing a specific implementation of NoSQL was also metaphorically coding the project into a corner as well. Finally, the placing clear, complete thought before any action almost always produces better results. I believe by evaluating the first three principles above, I would look at this last principle and decide to pass for now on supporting two database systems in order to facilitate getting the project done on time. Let's move on. In the final days, as the launch of the website neared, the OIG report found the project in a troubled state. The response was to add many more people. In just 1 month, they added 117% more people. I'm not going to do a pause and think, but is this how modern software engineers would handle this situation? Is this how you might attempt to catch up or recommend to management to fix the issue? I suspect the answer would be probably not. In the first week of class, we went over a number of software myths, and the graphic on CMS staffing boldly aligns with the first myth. If we get behind schedule, we can add more programmers and catch up. The second myth, a general statement about objectives is sufficient to begin building programs, seems to be the basis of how OIG was able to imply that agile programming actually was partially to blame for problems faced during the development of the HealthCare.gov website. Finally, the myth, change in project requirements can easily be accommodated because software is flexible, was shown not to be true for this website. The example of adding a specific brand of NoSQL at the 11th hour supports this as being a myth. In summary, the evidence of so many myths showing up in the OIG report seems to indicate many problems associated with HealthCare.gov may have had more to do with not following sound software engineering principles. This concludes my presentation. I hope you found this interesting and informative, and I thank you for watching.